The Kansas City Approach to Modern Money Theory by L. Randall Wray. Section 7. Functional Finance, Demand Management, and Full Employment. As mentioned above, Forstater brought Lerner's functional finance approach to MMT. The main argument is that the national government's budget should be functional, that is, formulated to serve the public purpose, rather than to achieve some preconceived balance, whether that be defined as setting spending equal to revenues, keeping deficits below some arbitrary ratio relative to GDP, such as the Maastricht Treaty's criteria of 3%, or keeping the ratio of government debt to GDP stable, that is below 60%, as Maastricht requires. Further, Lerner is famous for the government steering wheel metaphor. Using mostly fiscal policy, it can keep GDP growing at some Goldilocks rate, neither too hot to cause inflation nor too cold to cause unemployment. This was, of course, a common interpretation of the policy implications of Keynesian economics in the 1960s, which was likened to fine-tuning the economy, again with an emphasis on fiscal policy, as the early post-war Keynesians did not put much faith in the potency of monetary policy. While Minsky was influenced by the Keynesian Lerner approach to aggregate demand management, he rejected any notion of fine-tuning. Footnote 34. See Ray, 2018. End footnote. For Minsky, the most dangerous tendency in the post-war economy is the potential for runaway euphoric booms, not collapse, as he believed government would prevent a downturn from accelerating to a full-blown depression. It was precisely the recognition that government could prop up demand and intervene in a financial crisis that posed the greatest danger. If government could do this, it removed the possibility of severe downside risk, and hence fueled optimism that would build to euphoria. This was apparent in his strong criticism of the Kennedy-Johnson War on Poverty. Footnote 35. See Bell and Ray, 2004, for an account of Minsky's parallel development of an alternative approach to poverty while he was at Berkeley during the Kennedy-Johnson years. End footnote. Sure, he argued government could boost demand and move the economy closer to full employment, with some jobs trickling down to the poor. But this would unleash inflation and financial instability so that full employment could not be maintained. It could never resolve the poverty and unemployment problem, he warned, because government would reverse course by putting on the brakes. Further, he criticized welfare as a conservative rebuttal to the radicals' claim that poverty and unemployment represent failures of the capitalism system. He argued that charity should not be the basis of a government's response to those failures. For Minsky, getting to full employment would be easy, but remaining there would be difficult. In Chapter 24 of the General Theory, Keynes had warned of the two great faults of capitalism: the failure to operate at full employment and excessive inequality. Minsky added a third: the inherent tendency to financial instability, which could be fueled by policy to address the other faults. To tackle these faults, we need systemic reform, not welfare band-aids. Minsky used to provoke me by disparaging welfare. At the time, I knew he promoted a New Deal-style jobs program, what he called employer of last resort. But his hostility to welfare was puzzling. I had no knowledge of his earlier work, and hence no context in which to place his rejection of the Kennedy-Johnson approach that relied on maintaining high aggregate demand, providing Head Start, early childhood education, and skills training for adults, and tackling the culture of poverty. While I also rejected Daniel Patrick Moynihan's thesis that poverty could be alleviated only by changing the behavior of the poor, I held the typical liberal views of welfare. There were some hints of Minsky's views in his 1986 book, such as the argument that welfare and food stamps add to aggregate market overcosts and hence create price pressures. But I was unaware of his writings from the 1960s through the early 1970s on poverty, unemployment, and the employer of last resort. I found them only after he died, when I went through his office as well as his huge number of boxes stored at the Levy Institute's basement. Not only did I find those writings, some of which we collected for a short book published in 2013, but I also found a book manuscript that he worked on in the early 1990s. That manuscript put his critique and alternative within an updated framework that made it more clear why he thought that the welfare approach would promote inflation and financial instability. In laying out his approach to policy to address the inherent faults of capitalism, Minsky argued in his 1986 book that, quote, the emphasis on investment and economic growth, rather than on employment as a policy objective, is a mistake, end quote. He warned that focusing on growth could increase inequality and instability. The key arguments Minsky, 1986, made as he set out his employer of last resort, ELR approach were, number one, the policy problem is to develop a strategy for full employment that does not lead to instability, inflation, and unemployment. The main instrument of such a policy is the creation of an infinitely elastic demand for labor at a floor or minimum wage that does not depend on long and short-run profit expectations of business. Number two, since only government can divorce the offering of employment from the profitability of hiring workers, the infinitely elastic demand for labor must be created by government. Number three, the permanent programs will provide outputs, public services, environmental improvements, etc., that transfer payment government does not yield, as well as the creation and improvement of human resources. Number four, the fact that taxes need to be paid gives value to the money of the economy. The need to pay taxes means that people work and produce in order to get that in which taxes can be paid. End quote. Later, I found a manuscript he had written in 1969 where he explained, quote, I labeled an employer of last resort program as a wage support law, the terms upon which the government stands ready to employ all its analogous Later I found a manuscript he had written in 1969 where he explained, quote, I labeled an employer of last resort program as a wage support law. The terms upon which the government stands ready to employ all is analogous to the farm price support programs. End quote. Footnote 36. Republished in Minsky, 2013. End footnote. Bill Mitchell would later independently develop this idea to propose an employed buffer stock as a stabilizing alternative to the orthodox NIRU, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, and the Marxist reserve army of the unemployed. Footnote 37. Bill called it NIBR, the non-accelerating inflation buffer employment ratio, the ratio of the number employed in the employer of last resort program over the total employment. This would fluctuate automatically to stabilize the economy. End footnote. It began to be clear why Minsky had been hostile to welfare and why he saw the employer of last resort approach as the way to achieve sustained full employment without setting off inflation and financial instability. Using the program as a buffer stock of employed labor to stabilize wages, just as agricultural buffer stocks stabilize commodities prices. As Minsky had explained in various articles in the 1960s, and through the mid-1970s. The Keynesian pump priming approach would generally target spending to the most advanced sectors, for example, the military-industrial complex, that were unionized and oligopolized or provide tax subsidies to private investment. In his view, both of these would promote inflation and financial leveraging. By contrast, targeting spending to the unemployed, taking workers as they are and where they are, would directly benefit low-income individuals and communities. He preferred a trickle-up policy over a Keynesian demand-side or a neoclassical supply-side, trickle-down policy of pump priming or tax subsidies. By gradually raising the program's wage floor and at the same time constraining wages at the top, he hoped to reduce inequality of incomes. Many progressive critics of the job guarantee proposal have referred to a famous article by Kalecki, arguing that full employment is not politically possible in a capitalist economy. Footnote 38. The original article was published in 1943 and republished in 1971 in a collection of his essays. End footnote. As he put it, quote, "The maintenance of full employment would cause social and political changes, which would give a new impetus to the opposition of the business leaders. The SAC would cease to play its role as a disciplinary measure. The social position of the boss would be undermined, and the self-assurance and class consciousness of the working class would grow. Their class instinct tells them that lasting full employment is unsound from their point of view, and that unemployment is an integral part of the normal capitalist system." End quote. Kalecki, 1971. While there is much in Kalecki's article to recommend it, the main argument became outdated in what Minsky called the managerial welfare state version of capitalism, or what is often called social democratic capitalism in Europe, where big government, big business, and big labor cooperated to maintain high employment, substantially close to full employment, for many years and even decades in some countries. Further, social safety nets and even generous welfare systems in many countries were accepted by capitalists, also for decades. Finally, the means discussed by Kalecki that might be used to achieve full employment, such as ramped-up public infrastructure spending, did not include anything like the modern job guarantee policy proposals. Footnote 39. See Bill Mitchell's blog for a thorough review of Kalecki's arguments, along with a rebuttal of the potential use of them against the job guarantee program. End footnote. In my view, Minsky's arguments against the use of Keynesian pump priming to try to achieve full employment were more cogent than Kalecki's. Even if capitalists bought in to pump priming, and it could be argued that they did with their endorsement of what Joan Robinson called military Keynesianism, Minsky argued that full employment could not be sustained by maintaining high aggregate demand. It would cause inflation and financial instability. To the extent that we can see the 1960s as an experiment in maintenance of full employment, it did contribute to inflationary pressure and financial fragility. Minsky had argued that measures that can move the economy to full employment, such as raising aggregate demand, might not be able to keep it at full employment. This is why he proposed an alternative policy that targeted government spending directly to the unemployed. In retrospect, Minsky's earliest writing was remarkably prescient. The War on Poverty did fail, Bell and Wray, 2004. Financial instability did return, with a vengeance. The concern with inflation in the 1960s and early 1970s helped to fuel the turn to the most virulent form of pre-Keynesian neoclassical economics, and later to the rise of neoliberalism that destroyed organized labor and ramped up inequality. President Clinton finally ended welfare as we know it, effectively putting the final nail in the war on poverty's coffin. Minsky's alternative approach to stabilizing the economy with a targeted jobs program was always part of my Minsky course and became the most important policy pushed by our version of MMT.